My stepmom and dad called me a freeloader and left me behind while they went on vacation. They laughed as they drove away from the home they thought was theirs, expecting me to clean it for their return. They had forgotten one crucial detail. The house was mine. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The roar of the taxi pulling away from the curb was the sound of my world finally cracking. I stood at the living room window, a dish towel twisted in my hands, and watched the car disappear down the street. Inside it were my father, Mark, my stepmother, Brenda, and her daughter, Tiffany. They were on their way to the airport, off to a 2-week, all-inclusive resort in the Caribbean, a trip I had only learned about when I saw their new suitcases by the door. I was not invited. My exclusion wasn't a quiet oversight, it was a statement. Just moments before, as they dragged their luggage down the driveway, Brenda had turned back to look at me standing in the doorway. A wide, saccharine smile stretched across her face. "Don't forget to water the petunias, Laura," she'd called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "And while you're at it, maybe you can finally clean out the gutters. It's the least you can do, living here rent-free." My father had just grunted his agreement, too preoccupied with fitting a bag into the trunk to meet my eyes. But Tiffany, ever her mother's echo, had chimed in with a laugh that felt like a slap. "Yeah, Laura, don't want the real owners to come back to a messy house." Then came the final, gut-wrenching blow from Brenda. She'd paused, her hand on the car door, and her voice dropped into a conspiratorial, venomous whisper, loud enough only for me to hear. "You're nothing but a freeloader, living in our house like you own the place." The words hung in the humid morning air, sharp and poisonous. A freeloader. In my own home. The irony was so bitter it nearly choked me. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the dull ache of a grief that had never quite healed, now sharpened by this fresh wound. For years, I had swallowed their casual cruelty, their thinly veiled insults, their relentless campaign to make me feel like an intruder in the very rooms where my mother had raised me. I did it for my father, clinging to the hope that the man who had loved my mother, who had once loved me, was still in there somewhere. But as I watched them leave, their laughter echoing back at me, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a loud, dramatic snap, but a quiet, profound severance of a cord I hadn't realized was already frayed to its last thread. They thought they were leaving behind their unpaid maid for 2 weeks. They had no idea they were leaving behind a woman who had finally reached her limit. I was 28 years old, a senior paralegal at a respected law firm. I was competent, organized, and, thanks to my mother, financially secure. Yet, in this house, I was perpetually cast as the problematic, burdensome child who refused to grow up. The narrative Brenda had so carefully crafted was that she and my father were saints for allowing me to stay, for tolerating my presence in their generous home. They had repeated the lie so often, they had come to believe it themselves. My father, weak and eager for a peaceful life with his new wife, had simply adopted her version of reality. I walked back into the silent house. It felt cavernous, empty not just of people but of warmth. Every piece of furniture Brenda had chosen, every sterile gray wall she had painted over my mother's cheerful yellow, felt like an affront. This wasn't just a house, it was the last tangible piece of my mother. She had designed it, decorated it, and filled it with love. She had also, with incredible foresight, protected it. Brenda's words echoed in my mind, "Living in our house like you own the place." A slow, cold resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. I had been passive for too long, absorbing their toxicity in the name of a peace that never came. I had let them rewrite my family's history and erase my mother's memory from these walls. No more. I went to my bedroom, the one room they mostly left alone, and unlocked the small fireproof safe tucked away in my closet. Inside was a thick leather-bound portfolio. I pulled out a heavy sheaf of documents, the paper crisp and official. The words of the trust my mother had established were as clear today as they were the day her lawyer, Arthur Harrison, had walked me through them after her funeral. The deed, the trust agreements, the tax records I had been paying for years, it was all there. They had gone on vacation with their daughter, leaving me behind with a list of chores. They had laughed at me and called me a freeloader. They thought they held all the power. Betrayal was worse than their casual cruelty. It was the final erasure of my place in my own family. The first few days after they left were suffocatingly quiet. The silence in the house was a heavy blanket, amplifying the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock that had belonged to my mother's parents. Brenda had often talked about selling it, calling it dour and old-fashioned. Every tick felt like a countdown. My initial shock gave way to a wave of profound sadness. I wandered through the rooms, tracing the ghosts of happier memories. I saw my mother in the kitchen, humming as she baked cookies, her flour-dusted hands leaving white prints on the dark wood cabinets. I saw her in the garden, tending to the rose bushes that Brenda had promptly ripped out to plant perfectly manicured, soulless boxwoods. The grief I had managed to keep at a manageable distance for years came roaring back, intertwined with the fresh sting of my family's contempt. I spent the first 2 days in a fog, mechanically completing the chores on the list Brenda had left on the kitchen counter. 1. Defrost the deep freezer. 2. Polish the silver. 3. Wash all windows, inside and out. It was a list for a hired hand, not a daughter. As I scrubbed and polished, my resentment hardened into a diamond-sharp point of clarity. I wasn't just their maid, I was a placeholder, a ghost they tolerated because removing me seemed like too much effort. On the third day, my phone rang. It was my dad. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Laura, just checking in," he said, his voice distant and tinny, background noise of splashing and faint music filtering through the call. "I'm here," I replied, my voice flat. "Good, good, how's everything at the house?" he asked, the question perfunctory. He didn't care about me, he was checking on his property. "Everything is fine. The house is still standing," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. He either didn't notice or didn't care. "Great. Listen, Brenda was just wondering if you remembered to clean out the gutters. She said there's a big storm forecast for next week and doesn't want any overflow." My hand tightened on the phone. They were lounging by a pool thousands of miles away, and their primary concern was the state of the gutters. "I have it under control, Dad." "Okay, well, don't strain yourself," he said, a weak attempt at paternal concern. Then his voice changed, becoming rushed. "Anyway, Tiffany just won the water volleyball tournament. We're going to celebrate. Talk to you later." Before I could say another word, he hung up. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone in hand, and felt nothing. The space where my hurt and disappointment used to be was now a cold, calm void. He hadn't asked how I was. He hadn't apologized for leaving me behind. He had called to deliver instructions from his wife. That phone call was the confirmation I didn't know I needed. My father was gone, replaced by this stranger, who prioritized his new family's trivial triumphs over his own daughter's existence. The hope I had held onto for so long finally evaporated. I put the phone down and looked at the chore list again. Then, I slowly and deliberately tore it into tiny pieces and dropped them in the trash. I was done. Done cleaning for them, done waiting for them, done being their convenient, invisible daughter. A thought, cold and clear, surfaced in my mind. It was a phrase that had been buried deep within the legal jargon of my mother's trust, a clause Arthur Harrison had pointed out to me years ago. It was a provision for my protection, a failsafe she had insisted upon. The memory of his words was faint but insistent, a whisper of a promise. They thought they had everything figured out, that my compliance was guaranteed. But they had forgotten one crucial thing about my mother. She always had a plan. That night, I didn't sleep in my own bed. Instead, I went into the master bedroom, the room that had been my mother's and was now Brenda's gaudy sanctuary of beige and gold. I stripped the bed of her garish, high-thread count sheets and replaced them with the simple quilt my mother had made by hand, which I had kept stored away. I lay down on it, the familiar pattern soft beneath my fingers, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of strength. The house seemed to sigh around me, as if it too could finally breathe. My family had made a grave miscalculation. They assumed I was weak because I was quiet. They mistook my patience for passivity. They saw me as a freeloader in their house. They were about to find out they were guests in mine, and their stay was officially over. To understand the depth of their betrayal, you have to understand what I had lost. My mother, Elinor, was the sun around which my entire world revolved. She was a brilliant architect who had designed this house herself, every window placed to catch the morning light, every room flowing into the next with a sense of warmth and ease. When she got sick, our world shrank to the size of this house. I was 16, and I became her primary caregiver. My father, Mark, was always busy with work, always stressed, always finding reasons to be out of the house. It was me who learned to administer her medication, who sat with her through the long, painful nights, who read to her when her eyes grew too weak. In her final year, she and I spent countless hours talking. She told me about her fears for me, about her worry that my father's grief would make him weak and susceptible. "He's a good man, Laura," she had said, her voice thin as paper, "but he's a follower. He needs a strong partner to guide him. Promise me you'll always be strong on your own." She had also told me about the house. "This place is your inheritance," she'd explained, her hand resting on mine. "It's more than bricks and mortar, it's your security. I've set up a trust. Your father can live here for as long as he needs, but the house belongs to you. It will protect you." After she passed, my father was adrift. Within a year, he met Brenda. At first, I was relieved. She was vibrant and energetic, and she seemed to pull my father out of his fog. She was a lifestyle blogger, a vague profession that seemed to involve taking perfectly staged photos of expensive lattes and writing captions about living your best life. She was polished and charming on the surface, with a smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. Her first visit to the house was less of a social call and more of an appraisal. She walked through each room with a critical eye, commenting on the outdated fixtures and the cluttered bookshelves. "This place has good bones," she'd announced to my father, completely ignoring my presence, "but it needs a complete overhaul, a modern touch." Soon after they married, the overhaul began. My mother's warm, colorful paintings were replaced with generic abstract art in shades of gray. Her comfortable, well-loved furniture was carted away in favor of sharp-angled, uncomfortable pieces that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. Each change felt like a deliberate erasure of my mother's existence. When I tried to protest, my father would sigh wearily. "Laura, we're a new family now. We have to make new memories. Brenda just wants to make this house a home for all of us." But it was never a home for me. Brenda's daughter, Tiffany, moved in, and the two of them formed an impenetrable alliance. They would hold whispered conversations that would stop the moment I entered a room. My possessions would mysteriously go missing, only to turn up in the trash. Brenda was a master of passive aggression. She would praise Tiffany's mediocre grades in front of me, then immediately ask about my demanding job, framing it as a shame that I had to work so hard. She made pointed comments about the cost of groceries, sighing about how expensive it was to feed 3 adults, always looking directly at me. Her primary obsession, however, was finances. She was constantly asking my father about his investments, his savings, and my mother's life insurance policy, a policy that had been placed directly into my trust, a fact my father conveniently omitted. She would talk about their friends who were buying vacation homes or luxury cars, her voice filled with a carefully cultivated envy. "If only we had a little more financial freedom, Mark," she would say. "If only we didn't have so many obligations." The implication was always clear. I was the obligation. One evening a few months before their trip, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. Brenda was speaking to my father in a low, urgent tone, believing I was out for the evening. "Mark, we need to talk about the house," she said. "It's time we sold it. The market is high, and we could get a fortune for this place. We could buy something smaller, more modern, and have enough left over to finally be comfortable." My father sounded hesitant. "I don't know, Brenda. This was Elinor's house. Laura grew up here." Brenda's voice turned sharp as ice. "Elinor is gone, and Laura is a grown woman living under our roof for free. It's not healthy. Selling this place would be the push she needs to finally get her own life. We're enabling her by letting her stay here like a child. We could give her a small portion of the sale to help with a deposit on an apartment. It's more than fair. A small portion of the sale, of my own house. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. My father's response was a weak mumble of acquiescence, a promise to think about it. I knew then that Brenda wasn't just a difficult stepmother, she was a predator. She saw my mother's legacy as a pile of cash waiting to be claimed, and me as the final obstacle in her way. That conversation was the reason I saw Ted keeping the trust documents in a safe in my room. It was the moment I realized that my quiet, unassuming life was built on a foundation they were actively trying to shatter. The morning after my father's dismissive phone call, the fog of grief had completely lifted, replaced by a steely, cold resolve. I was no longer a victim of their emotional warfare. I was a strategist. As a senior paralegal, my entire career was built on organization, evidence, and the precise execution of the law. For the first time, I looked at my situation not as a messy family drama, but as a case to be won. And my mother had left me the perfect, ironclad legal argument. My first step was a call to Arthur Harrison. He had been my mother's lawyer for decades and had become a close family friend. He was a kind, silver-haired man with a sharp mind and a comforting, grandfatherly demeanor. After my mother passed, he had made me promise to call him if I ever needed anything, especially regarding the trust. "Arthur, it's Laura," I said when he answered. "I need to talk to you about the trust my mother set up, specifically about the protective withdrawal clause." There was a brief pause on the line. "Laura," he said, his voice instantly serious, "is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be," I replied, a sense of empowerment in my voice that I hadn't felt in years. "I'm ready to enact it." We met at his office that afternoon. The space was filled with old books and the faint scent of leather, a sanctuary of order and reason. I explained everything, the years of subtle and overt cruelty, Brenda's attempts to sell the house, and the final, humiliating insult before they left on vacation. I laid it all out, not with tears, but with the cool precision of a paralegal presenting evidence. Arthur listened patiently, his hands steepled on his large mahogany desk. He nodded slowly as I spoke, his expression growing sterner with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a sad, knowing smile. "Your mother was a very wise woman," he said softly. "She worried this day might come. She called this the in case of emergency, break glass provision." He pulled a thick file from a cabinet, my file. He opened it to a tabbed section. "The trust officially transfers ownership to you on your 30th birthday. However, your mother included Article 4, Section B, the clause of premature tenancy termination." He slid the document across the desk to me. Even though I'd read it before, the words now seemed to glow with purpose. It stated that if the appointed trustee, my father, engaged in or permitted behavior that caused me, the beneficiary, significant emotional or financial distress, or if he attempted to liquidate the primary asset, the house, against my interests, I had the right to petition for immediate and full control of the trust. Their actions, particularly Brenda's stated intention to sell the property and their consistent mistreatment, are a clear violation of the spirit and letter of this trust, Arthur explained. "We have more than enough grounds to proceed. The process will be swift. I'll file the petition with the probate court first thing in the morning. Given the evidence, a judge will likely grant the order within 48 hours. From that moment, your father will no longer be the trustee, and you will be the sole legal owner of the property at 123 Maple Drive." The name of my street, spoken with such finality, sent a shiver down my spine. This was real. "What happens next?" I asked. "Once the order is granted," Arthur said, his tone shifting from gentle advisor to determined lawyer, "you have every legal right to secure your property. The first thing you will do is hire a locksmith. The second is to have the utility bills transferred solely into your name. The third, and this is the most difficult part, is to inform them that they are no longer welcome. As they are family members and not tenants with a lease, they will be considered tenants at will. We will serve them with a formal 30-day notice to vacate. The plan was clear, clinical, and powerful. It was my clever trap, laid out for me years ago by a mother who had seen the future. My role was simple: execute. Over the next 2 days, I moved with quiet efficiency. I contacted a 24-hour locksmith and scheduled an appointment. I spent hours on the phone with the electric, water, and gas companies, using the legal paperwork Arthur had prepared to transfer the accounts into my name. With each step, I felt a layer of the helplessness I had lived with for so long peel away. I was no longer the freeloader in the corner. I was the owner of the estate, a woman taking back control. The court order came through on a Friday morning. Arthur called me with the news. "It's done, Laura. The house is yours, officially and unequivocally." I hung up the phone and stood in the center of the living room, the room Brenda had so proudly ruined. I looked at the cold, gray walls and the soulless furniture. But for the first time, I didn't see her victory. I saw a blank canvas. I saw my future. The investigation was over. The case was won. Now, all that was left was the verdict, and I would be the one to deliver it. The day before my family was due to return, I received a notification on my phone. It was a social media post from Brenda. The photo was of her, my dad, and Tiffany, all tanned and beaming, clinking glasses filled with colorful drinks against a backdrop of a perfect turquoise ocean. The caption read, "Soaking up the last bit of paradise. So sad to leave, but excited to get back to our beautiful home. A perfect trip with my perfect family." Our beautiful home. The possessiveness of it, the casual erasure of me, sent a fresh jolt of anger through me, fortifying my resolve. It was the final piece of evidence I needed to remind myself why I was doing this. Their flight was scheduled to land in the late afternoon the following day. I spent the morning preparing. The locksmith had come and gone, leaving me with a new set of shiny brass keys. The old locks, the ones my family had keys for, were sitting in a box in the garage. I walked through the house, making small changes. I took down the generic gray art and leaned one of my mother's vibrant landscapes against the wall in its place. I moved the grandfather clock from the hallway into the center of the living room, its steady ticking a comforting, solid presence. I didn't pack their things. I wasn't going to sink to that level. Their rooms remained untouched, silent testaments to the life they thought they were returning to. My only goal was to establish a clear, legal boundary. Around 5 o'clock, I saw the familiar shape of a taxi pull up to the curb. My heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I took a deep breath, clutching the legal documents Arthur had couriered over that morning. I was ready. I watched through the window as they stumbled out of the car, laden with luggage and duty-free bags. They looked tired but happy, their faces still glowing from the sun. My dad paid the driver while Brenda and Tiffany started up the walkway, laughing about something. The moment of truth came when Brenda reached the front door and inserted her key into the lock. I heard the scrape of metal, a jiggle, and then a confused silence. She tried again. Nothing. "Mark, the key's not working," she called out, her voice tight with irritation. "Did you lock the deadbolt from the inside before we left?" "I don't think so," my dad said, walking up the steps. He took the key from her and tried it himself with the same result. A look of puzzlement crossed his face. "That's strange. It must be jammed." He raised his hand to knock, but I opened the door before his knuckles could touch the wood. I stood there, framed in the doorway, holding a folder of papers. The three of them stared at me. Their sun-drenched smiles faded, replaced by masks of confusion and annoyance. "Laura, what's wrong with the door?" my dad asked. "Why did you change the locks?" "I didn't change the locks on your house," I said, my voice calm and even, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. "I changed them on mine." Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief and scorn. "What are you talking about, you silly girl? Have you lost your mind? Open the door and stop playing games." She tried to push past me, but I stood firm. I'm not playing games, Brenda, I said, looking her directly in the eye. This house is not, nor has it ever been, yours. My mother left it to me in a trust. And as of yesterday morning, I have assumed full legal control of that trust. I held out the folder. My father took it numbly, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. His eyes scanned the top page, the court order, stamped and official. His face went pale, the color draining from beneath his vacation tan. He looked from the paper to me and back again, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. Brenda, however, was not so easily silenced. "This is ridiculous, it's a trick," she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "Mark, she's lying, you own this house, we have the deed." "Actually, you don't," I said, my voice still level. "You have a certificate of residency, which allowed Dad to live here as the trustee. But the deed has been in the trust's name for the last 12 years, a trust of which I am the sole beneficiary." Her face contorted with rage. The polished, charming mask fell away completely, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. "You ungrateful little brat," she spat. "After everything we've done for you, letting you live here, feeding you, putting a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us, by forging documents and trying to throw us out on the street." Her poorly executed threat, the accusation of forgery, was the final confirmation. She was just entitled, she was delusional. She had constructed a reality so complete in her own mind that she couldn't comprehend any other truth. "Nothing has been forged, Brenda," I said. "You can call Arthur Harrison. His number is on the letterhead. He will confirm everything. In the meantime, you are trespassing." At the word trespassing, Tiffany, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "You can't do this," she whined. "All my stuff is in there, this is our home." "No," I said, my gaze sweeping over the three of them, the furious stepmother, the whining stepsister, and my pale, silent father. "It was my mother's home, and now it's mine." Brenda's immediate reaction was to escalate. "I'm calling the police," she screamed, fumbling for her phone. "We'll see who's trespassing when they arrest you for fraud." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "I'd be happy to show them the court order." My father finally found his voice. It was a weak, pleading whisper. "Laura, please, let's just go inside and talk about this. There has to be a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding, Dad, was your belief that you could one day sell my mother's house out from under me," I replied, my words sharp. "I heard you and Brenda talking months ago. This isn't a surprise. This is a consequence." His face crumpled, a mask of guilt and shock. He knew I was telling the truth. Brenda, seeing his resolve failing, doubled down on her rage. She did call the police. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later, looking bored and weary, as if they were all too used to messy domestic disputes. Brenda launched into a hysterical tirade, painting me as a disturbed, vindictive child who had locked her loving family out of their home. I simply waited until she was finished, then calmly presented the officers with the notarized court documents and Arthur Harrison's business card. One of the officers made a call. After a brief conversation, he handed my papers back to me and turned to Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and official, "the paperwork seems to be in order. This is a civil matter. From what we can see, the owner of this property has requested that you leave. We cannot force her to let you in." Brenda's face turned a mottled shade of red. "So that's it, she can just throw us out." "You can take it up with your lawyer, ma'am. For now, I suggest you find somewhere else to stay for the night." The officers got back in their car and drove away, leaving us in the deepening twilight. The defeat was palpable. Tiffany started to cry. My father just stood there, looking utterly broken. Brenda, however, was not done fighting. Over the next few days, she began a campaign of desperation. First came the pleading text messages from my dad, clearly dictated by her. They were a bizarre mix of feigned remorse and passive-aggressive guilt trips. "Laura, your mother would be so disappointed to see you treating your family this way. Brenda is willing to forgive you if you just see reason." I didn't respond. Then came the calls from relatives, aunts and uncles who had only ever heard Brenda's side of the story. They called to tell me how selfish and cruel I was being to my poor father. I calmly explained the situation to the few who were willing to listen and ignored the rest. Meanwhile, Arthur was building our case for the eviction. He advised me that while we had every right to remove them, Brenda might try to contest it, dragging things out in court. The best way to ensure a swift resolution, he'd said, is to remove any doubt about her character and motivations. He suggested we hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but Arthur was insistent. A woman this obsessed with money and appearances often has a history, he'd reasoned. It didn't take long for the investigator to find what we were looking for. It turned out Brenda's lifestyle blog was funded by a string of bad debts and credit cards opened in my father's name without his full knowledge. But the real bombshell was her previous marriage. The investigator found her ex-husband, a quiet man who ran a hardware store in a neighboring state. He told a story that was chillingly familiar. He had inherited his family business. Brenda had been charming and supportive at first, but after they were married, she began pressuring him to sell the business, to liquidate his assets so they could travel and really live. When he refused, she became emotionally abusive, isolating him from his family and running up huge debts. Their divorce had been messy and financially devastating for him. Arthur arranged a sworn affidavit from the ex-husband, a legal document detailing Brenda's pattern of predatory behavior. It was irrefutable proof. This wasn't a one-time misjudgment. This was who she was. Armed with this new evidence, I was ready for the final confrontation. My father had been texting me, begging for a chance to talk, alone. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown. He looked terrible. He had aged 10 years in a week. He started with a rambling, incoherent apology, full of excuses about how he just wanted to keep Brenda happy, how he didn't realize how far things had gone. "I know you heard us talking about selling the house," he admitted, shamefaced. "I never would have gone through with it, Laura, I promise." "It doesn't matter anymore, Dad," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You stood by and let her call me a freeloader in my own home. You let her try to erase every memory of Mom. You chose her. Now you have to live with that choice." He started to protest, to argue that it wasn't true, but I stopped him. I slid a file across the table. It contained a copy of the affidavit from Brenda's ex-husband and a summary of the debts she had accumulated in my father's name. "This is who you chose," I said quietly. "Read it." He opened the file, and as he read, the last bit of fight seemed to drain out of him. He saw the pattern, the calculated deception. He saw that he wasn't her partner, he was her target. The spell she had woven around him for years was finally, irrevocably broken. The struggle in his eyes, the loyalty he felt he owed her, was extinguished, replaced by the horrifying clarity of the truth. The 30-day notice to vacate was set to expire on a Saturday. In a final act of theatrical defiance, Brenda had insisted on organizing a farewell brunch at the house. She had invited several extended family members, framing the event as a dignified departure, a chance for them to say goodbye to the home they had so lovingly cared for. In reality, it was a last-ditch effort to garner sympathy and paint me as the villain in a public setting. She intended to use the gathering as a stage for her final, dramatic performance. I knew this, and I was prepared to let her have her stage. I would simply be writing the final scene. I allowed them access to the house for the brunch, with the condition that all of their belongings had to be removed by 5 o'clock that evening. When I arrived an hour into the event, the living room was filled with relatives, all of them casting awkward, pitying glances in my direction. Brenda was holding court near the fireplace, dressed in an elegant white dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. My father stood silently by her side, looking like a hollowed-out version of himself. Tiffany was passing around a platter of canapés, her expression a perfect blend of tragedy and indignation. Brenda saw me enter, and her performance began. "Oh, Laura, darling," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be so difficult for you, having to take on this big house all by yourself." A murmur of sympathy for Brenda rippled through the room. My Aunt Susan, my father's sister, approached me. "Laura, I really think you're making a terrible mistake," she said in a hushed, scolding tone. "Your father is heartbroken." I gave her a small, polite smile and walked toward the center of the room. I cleared my throat, and a hush fell over the assembled family. "I'm glad you're all here," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Because it's important that the whole family understands the truth of this situation. Brenda is right. This is a difficult day, but the difficulty began long before today." I looked directly at Brenda, whose smile was now frozen on her face. "For years, I have been treated as an unwelcome guest in my own home. I have been called a freeloader, a burden, all while I was quietly paying the property taxes and upkeep on this house from the inheritance my mother left me." Another ripple went through the room, this one of shock. Brenda quickly recovered. "That's a vicious lie," she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "Mark has paid every bill in this house." "Has he?" I asked, turning my gaze to my father. "Dad, why don't you tell them about the second mortgage you took out last year, the one Brenda needed to fund her business venture? The one that put this house, my house, at risk." My father flinched as if struck. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I wasn't finished. I held up a thin folder. "Brenda has painted herself as the victim here, but it seems to be a role she is very familiar with. This is a sworn affidavit from her first husband." I began to read aloud the damning testimony of a man who had been financially and emotionally manipulated, a man who had almost lost his family business to her greed, a man whose story was almost identical to my father's. With each word, the atmosphere in the room grew colder. The looks of pity directed at me turned into looks of suspicion directed at Brenda. Her face had gone from pale to ashen. "She's lying," Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. "He was a bitter man, he's twisting everything." "Is he?" I said, pulling out the final document. "Then perhaps you can explain these. Credit card statements, Al. L in Dad's name, for purchases none of you can afford. Luxury trips, designer clothes, spa days, all part of the lifestyle you sell online, funded by my father's debt and my mother's legacy." I didn't need to say anything more. The proof was right there. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect wife, the gracious hostess, the tragic victim, crumbled into dust. The family members looked from the papers in my hand to Brenda, then to my father's guilt-ridden face. They saw the truth. It was my father who delivered the final, decisive blow. He had been silent through the entire exchange, but now he seemed to find a spine he had misplaced years ago. He stepped away from Brenda's side, creating a physical and symbolic distance between them. He looked at her, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. "It's over, Brenda," he said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating through the silent room. "The lies are over." That was the moment of her final, public humiliation. It wasn't my victory, it was her undoing. The family started to quietly filter out, muttering apologies to me as they left, their eyes avoiding Brenda. Within minutes, the room was empty except for the three of them and me. Brenda stood there, exposed and defeated. Tiffany, finally seeing her mother for who she truly was, burst into tears. My father looked at me, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. The show was over. The aftermath of the brunch was swift and decisive. Brenda, stripped of her audience and her power, fell apart. Her desperate attempts to maintain control dissolved into a pathetic retreat. Without my father's financial support and facing the public shame of her exposure, her carefully curated world imploded. The moving truck they had arranged arrived on schedule at 5 o'clock. I watched from the window as they loaded the last of their boxes, a somber and silent trio. There were no more insults, no more theatrics. There was only the quiet, heavy reality of their defeat. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Brenda's financial deception came to light. With Arthur's guidance, my father began the painful process of untangling his finances. He discovered debts he never knew existed and learned that his credit was in ruins. Facing the consequences of his passivity was his penance. He and Brenda separated almost immediately. Her downfall was total. Without a source of income, she was forced to move in with a relative in another state, her lifestyle blog abandoned, her social standing obliterated. Tiffany went with her, the shock of their changed circumstances a harsh lesson in humility. My father moved into a small, furnished apartment across town. A few weeks after the eviction, he asked if I would meet him for coffee. The meeting was different from our last one. He didn't offer excuses or ask for pity. He simply apologized. "I failed you, Laura," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed your mother. I was a coward. I let Brenda's voice become louder than my own conscience, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope one day you can." It was the first honest thing he had said in years. I listened, and I knew the road to forgiveness would be long, but for the first time, it seemed possible. Our relationship wouldn't be what it was, but perhaps we could build something new, something based on a difficult, painful truth. With the house finally quiet, I began the slow and joyful process of reclaiming it. I hired painters, and we covered the sterile gray walls with the warm yellows and soft blues my mother had loved. I pulled her old furniture out of storage, and each piece felt like welcoming an old friend home. The house started to breathe again, to feel like a home. I called on my professional network from the law firm to help my father navigate his legal and financial troubles. It wasn't for his sake, but for mine. Ensuring he was stable meant he wouldn't be dependent on me, and it allowed me to close that chapter with a clean conscience. Justice, I learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring balance. I ensured Brenda faced legal consequences for her financial fraud, providing my father's lawyers with all the evidence we had gathered. She was forced to pay restitution, a final, definitive consequence for her actions. One sunny afternoon, I was in the garden, planting rose bushes in the exact spot where my mother's used to be. My hands were covered in soil, the sun was warm on my back, and the grandfather clock was ticking steadily inside. A profound sense of peace washed over me. The house was no longer a battleground or a monument to my grief. It was my sanctuary, my inheritance, my future. Brenda had called me a freeloader, trying to make me feel small and powerless. But her cruelty had been a gift. It had forced me to find the strength my mother always knew I had. I wasn't a guest in me own else's life anymore. I was the owner of mine, and I was finally truly home.